Nineveh, they found where Nineveh's at. It's in current-day Mosul. And they did some archaeological digs there, and it's incredibly interesting what they found. Because they found, the first thing they found was called the Taylor Stele. Taylor Stele is talking about the fact that Sennacherib actually exists. And now this is completely separate from the Bible. This is from Assyria. So they're not referencing the Bible at all. You want to try to say, oh, that's just a biblical thing and they're making up the story. The problem is that they've got the exact same story coming out of Nineveh. Nineveh, they found the Taylor Stele, they found a bunch of stuff after that. But the documentation is interesting because once they start talking about this, first of all, they named Sennacherib. That's the king of Assyria at the time. They've now found out exactly when this all happened. It's really interesting to me. We've been talking about this for a couple weeks now. There's portions of almost like a yearly calendar that they found in Nineveh. And this daily calendar yearly calendar talks about events that have happened during the year. And one particular spot where they're mentioning this particular event, they have mentioned the fact that there was an eclipse. The documents in Nineveh talk about an eclipse. And the problem has been, we're talking about for archaeology, the problem is trying to get things dated again, trying to correlate the Georgian calendar we use now with what they were using then, with what the Hebrews used the calendar, trying to get those all to jive. And they had a heck of a time doing that, trying to figure out when during the BC time, when this all stuff happened, because BC is before Christ. And if you look at the fact that this is 800 years before that, when you say 800 BC, does that have any impact on what those guys were looking at? It has none. That's just the way we look at it, how we judge time. But when they found this fact that they had an eclipse in Nineveh, this was profound because they can tell exactly when that eclipse happened. They turned the clock back. NASA's got it all diagrammed out. They can tell you when the eclipses are going to be in the future, and they can also tell you exactly when the eclipses were in the past. So when they mention an eclipse happened at a certain time, now they can go in and they can find out exactly when that was. And it was 701 BC. No, I'm sorry, the eclipse was 763 BC. That's when the eclipse happened. Right. So now they have a timetable, and they can start evaluating things from that timetable, because now they can line up what the Hebrew talks about on the invasion, later on, the invasion of Judah and Israel by the Assyrians. They can now find that out. From now they know when Hezekiah was king, and they can back that up because it says in Hezekiah's 14th year of his reign, that's when the invasion happened. And now they can correlate that to when the Assyrian documents are talking about, and they can line those all up. But the interesting about this, what really kind of fascinated me about this, we got some other things that you sent me this morning. I'll let you talk about those. But this eclipse that happened in 763 BC, when you start looking at two different books, the book of Amos that Greg's going through on Sundays, on Wednesdays, he brought out the fact that in Amos chapter 8, verse 9, it talks about an eclipse. And Amos is the document that's around that same time frame, middle 800 BCs. And also, not only that, but also Jonah. Jonah's written about it. Jonah lived about that same time as well. And to me, and this is a question that I've heard, and I've had a question as well, how does a guy showing a Hebrew guy, say he's a man right now, showing up in Nineveh have any impact whatsoever on why those people would listen to him? Just because he showed up, maybe he got the story about him coming out of the belly of a fish. Maybe the Assyrians knew something about that. Maybe they didn't. But the fact that they found this eclipse, now in the ancient times when an eclipse happened, this was something major. They figured something's going on here. Some other god put his hand in front of the sun that we worship, and we've got a problem here. We don't know what happened. They're scared to death over this. That's the particular part that if I'm just imagining things here. But if Jonah was around at that point and walking into Assyria to get his message across, was God going to make an eclipse happen at that time to get these people attention and try to get them to listen to Jonah? And then tell us what else you found about that too.
Well, what I found out is that there's writings from Nineveh indicating that things like eclipses, plague, famine, earthquakes, these were all, signs from God. And the chronology from their perspective, this is not biblical at all. This is totally this Assyrian writings that they found in these tablets. So in about 787 BC, they went from a polytheistic religion to monotheistic, and their monotheistic god was Nabu. And then there was a plague in 765, a revolt in 763. In 763, June 15th,
yeah,
is when there was this total eclipse of the sun. So at midday, there was a complete eclipse of the sun in Nineveh and that area around there, and they can tell where the shadow would have been cast. Then in 762, a revolt, another revolt in 761, another revolt in 760. So they're having a bunch of civil unrest. 759, there was another plague, and then they talk about in 758 peace in the land. Okay, and that's where it's believed that this peace in the land came from the repentance brought by the preaching of Jonah. So you're talking here about 5 years from this eclipse, and right there with plagues and these kind of things. So when Jonah comes in and says, hey, 40 days and this city's going to be destroyed,
they're already waiting for it.
There you go.
They're already waiting for this to happen. They're scared to death. All this stuff's going on in their city. None of this has happened before, and they just made this change to this different god that they decided to worship. And they're just, their minds, when all this stuff is happening, they're looking for something.
So to be clear then, when these natural phenomenon are occurring in their own religious writings, they're attaching a supernatural omen to it. This was like a predictive event of doom, future doom.
Yep.
So that when Jonah shows up,
this Hebrew guy that maybe they heard about the fish, maybe they didn't, but the fish really doesn't matter at this point. They've got their own problems that they're seeing. They've got their own difficulties that are going on in the city, which to that point was the richest place around. They were doing very, very well. And when they went to war, they won every single time. But now, it seems to me that all this stuff going on has got them thinking, what are we doing wrong here? Because now the God has covered up the sun. He's allowed all this plagues to happen to us. And this Jewish guy comes into town saying, 40 days from now and you guys are toast. He said, well, you think about it, the guys that are there, even the government saying, well, we've been toast for a while now. All kinds of bad things have been happening to us. Maybe this guy's got some point. I don't know, maybe Jonah walked in, he'd been in the belly of a fish, and he was all bleached out. Maybe his hair was bleached out from the acid that's in the fish. Maybe his clothes were as well. But just a Jewish guy showing up at this place, because the Assyrians were not nice people. They're very, very violent people. And this guy walking in and just starting in on these people, they say, what gives you the courage to come here and talk to us anyway? But now they're in a point where they're going to listen. And I believe that God does that to us too. As far as me goes, there was an event in my life that made me turn around and look at God. And it wasn't an event that anybody wants to go through, but sometimes God gets your attention from things that are not expected and maybe very tragic, but he gets your attention in that way. And it seems to me that's exactly what he did with the people of Nineveh. He said there are a bunch of people that don't know their right hand from their left. God had compassion on them because they were, the Ninevites were, like I said, they weren't nice people. When they took over a city, they killed most of the people in it. And to the rest of them, they took home and made them do tasks and walked them home with hooks in their jaw. That's how they got home. They walked in line with hooks in their jaw. That's how they got the people from where they were, from Jerusalem, all the way over to Nineveh. And that's a long route. That's how those people got there, with these hooks in their jaw. So these were not nice people, but Jonah walked in because God told him to after a little bit of tribulation beforehand. Jonah says, well, hold on a second. These guys are not very nice people. I don't want to go that way. But God just said, okay, well, that's where you're going. We're going to have a fish spit you out on the ground. But it's fascinating to me that once you look into the archaeology, you start getting questions answered. Because I had questions, like probably lots of you do. How did Jonah get these guys' attention? How could that have been? And then you start looking at the archaeology and you start realizing they were ready. They're ready for it.